Have you ever wondered what happens when a society completely loses its moral compass? When everyone just does whatever they feel is right, with no regard for anyone else? The Bible gives us a chilling look into a time just like that, and it's a story that serves as a powerful warning for us today. This all takes place during the time of the judges in ancient Israel. The book of Judges tells us repeatedly, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This isn't a good thing. It means there was no central leadership, no one to uphold justice, and most importantly, people had turned their backs on God's laws. It was a recipe for disaster. Society was crumbling from the inside out, and the story we're about to dive into is one of the darkest in the entire Old Testament. It shows just how far people can fall when they abandon God and follow their own broken desires. Our story begins with a man, a Levite, who lived in the remote hill country of Ephraim. Levites were set apart for God's service, kind of like priests or religious ministers. You'd expect a man like this to be a moral example, right? Well, this Levite took a concubine, a secondary wife from Bethlehem in Judah. This was a common practice back then, but it was a step down from God's original design for marriage. Right from the start, we see a compromise, a small crack in the foundation that's about to lead to a total collapse. Things get complicated quickly. The woman was unfaithful to him and ran back to her father's house in Bethlehem. After 4 months, the Levite decides to go after her. He wants to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He travels with his servant and a couple of donkeys. When he arrives, his father-in-law is overjoyed to see him. In fact, he's so happy that he persuades the Levite to stay. And stay, and stay. For 5 days, they feast and celebrate. The father-in-law seems desperate to keep his daughter's husband there. On the surface, it looks like generous hospitality, but there's a strange sense of urgency, almost an avoidance of what's waiting for them back home. On the 5th day, the Levite is finally determined to leave. Even though his father-in-law begs him to stay one more night, he sets off late in the afternoon with his concubine and his servant. As evening approaches, they near the city of Gibeah, which we now know as Jerusalem. His servant suggested they stop there for the night. It was a walled city, a sensible place to find lodging and safety. But the Levite refused. He looked at the city and saw not a fortress of refuge, but a city of foreigners, the Jebusites. He said, "We will not turn aside into a city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel." Instead, he insisted they press on a little further to a place called Gibeah. Now, this decision is absolutely crucial to understanding the tragedy that unfolds. Why Gibeah? Because Gibeah was a town belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. These were not foreigners. These were his kinsmen, fellow Israelites. The Levite was banking on the sacred bond of brotherhood. In ancient Israel, hospitality wasn't just a nicety. It was a deeply ingrained cultural and religious duty, especially towards a fellow Israelite. You were expected to open your home to travelers, to provide food, water, and a safe place to rest. By choosing Gibeah over Jebus, the Levite was making a statement. I trust my own people. My own brothers will surely take me in. He believed he would find safety and welcome among those who shared his heritage and his faith. He was expecting the best of his countrymen. So they pushed onward, arriving in Gibeah just as dusk settled over the town. They made their way to the city's public square, the central hub of community life. This is where you'd expect someone to spot them, a weary traveler, his servant, his concubine, and their donkeys, and immediately offer them a place to stay. They sat down, waiting for that expected invitation, that gesture of kinship. They waited. And they waited. The minutes turned into an hour, then longer. People walked by, glanced at them, and continued on their way. No one approached. No door opened. No voice called out, "Come, be my guest for the night." Can you imagine the growing sense of unease, the confusion turning to dread? They were in a town of their own people, yet they were utterly alone, ignored, and invisible in the heart of the community. The very hospitality the Levite had counted on was nowhere to be found. They were Israelites in an Israelite town, being treated like complete outcasts. The silence in that square was deafening. a chilling sign that something was deeply wrong in Gibeah. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, as true darkness fell, an old man appeared. He was coming in from his work in the fields. He saw the small, dejected group sitting in the square and stopped. But here's the twist. This man wasn't from Gibeah. He wasn't even a Benjaminite. The Bible tells us he was from the hill country of Ephraim, just like the Levite, but was living in Gibeah as a foreigner, a sojourner. The one person who showed them any kindness was an outsider himself. He approached them and asked the obvious questions, "Where are you coming from and where are you going?" The Levite explained their situation, how they were on their way home and how no one in this whole town had offered them a roof over their heads, even though they had their own provisions and needed nothing but shelter. The old man's response was immediate and filled with a warmth that had been so starkly absent. "Peace be to you," he said. "Let me take care of all your needs." And then he gave a chilling warning. "Only do not spend the night in the square." Why? Because he knew the truth about Gibeah. He knew the public square was not a place of safety after dark. It was a place of danger. He understood the depravity that lurked in the hearts of the men of that city. The one person who upheld the laws of hospitality was the one who didn't even belong there. He welcomed them into his home, a small act of kindness that would soon stand in stark contrast to an unimaginable evil. He brought the weary travelers inside, washed their feet, fed them and their donkeys, and for a brief moment it seemed they had finally found the refuge they had been seeking. It seemed like they had found a safe haven for the night. But the peace was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. As darkness fell over Gibeah, a group of wicked men from the city gathered outside the old man's house. They began pounding on the door, their intentions vile and clear. They demanded that the host bring out the Levite, the visitor he had welcomed, so they could commit a terrible act of violence against him. This was a chilling echo of the story of Sodom, a sign of just how far the society had fallen into depravity. The old man, terrified but still bound by the sacred laws of hospitality, went out to confront the mob. He pleaded with them, begging them not to commit such a great evil. He called them his brothers, appealing to their shared heritage and humanity. He even offered his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine to them, hoping to appease their rage and protect his male guest. It's a shocking proposal that shows how deeply distorted their moral compass had become, where the safety and dignity of women were seen as disposable. But the mob refused. Their lust for violence was fixated on the Levite. Seeing the situation escalating and fearing for his own life, the Levite did something unimaginable. In a moment of supreme cowardice and betrayal, he took his own concubine, the woman he was supposed to protect, and pushed her out the door into the hands of the waiting mob. He sacrificed her to save himself. This single act reveals a profound moral sickness. It wasn't just the lawless men of the city who were corrupt. The corruption had reached even a Levite, a man from a tribe set apart for religious service. He failed in his most basic duty to protect the vulnerable person entrusted to his care. The very people who were supposed to be moral guides had become part of the problem. This wasn't just a crime. It was a symptom of a nation in spiritual freefall, where God's laws were forgotten and every person did what was right in their own eyes. The night was far from over, and the consequences of this evil would soon shake the entire nation of Israel. As the first light of dawn broke over the city of Gibeah, a new and even darker chapter of this tragedy began to unfold. Inside the old man's house, the Levite awoke. The sounds of the night, the brutal chaos at his very door, had faded into an unsettling silence. He prepared to continue his journey, seemingly eager to put the horrors of Gibeah behind him. He opened the door, ready to step out into the morning air, and his path was blocked. There, on the threshold, lay his concubine. Her hands were outstretched, clutching the doorstep as if in a final, desperate plea for entry, for safety that never came. She had endured the entire night, a nightmare beyond our imagination, at the hands of the wicked men of the city. As the sun rose, her strength finally gave out and she collapsed right where her torment had begun. The Levite looked down at the motionless form of the woman who had been his companion. "Get up," he said. "Let's go." His words hung in the still morning air, devoid of any warmth, any concern. There was no response. She didn't move. She couldn't. He reached down, perhaps shaking her, perhaps simply trying to move her out of his way. It was then he must have realized the awful truth. She was gone. Now, what happens next is one of the most chilling parts of this entire account. The Bible doesn't record any tears from the Levite. It doesn't mention any cry of anguish, any outburst of grief or rage. There is no moment of tender mourning for the woman who had just suffered an unspeakable fate to spare him. The text is stark, cold, and silent on his emotional state. This silence is deafening. It screams of the profound moral decay and the utter devaluation of human life that had gripped the society of the time. A person, a woman, his own concubine, was treated as little more than an inconvenience, an object. Instead of preparing a proper burial or seeking immediate justice in Gibeah, the Levite did something methodical and unnerving. He lifted her lifeless body from the ground, placed her upon his donkey, the same donkey that was meant to carry her home safely, and he turned back toward his own house. He was no longer just a traveler. He was now a man carrying a terrible burden, both physically and, one would hope, morally. The journey home must have been a silent, somber procession. The roads that should have been filled with the relief of returning home were now shadowed by this grim reality. What was going through his mind? Was it shock? Was it a cold, calculated anger? Or was it something far more disturbing, a complete emotional disconnect? The story forces us to confront this question. His actions suggest a man who has been pushed past the brink, but not into sorrow. Instead, he seems to be moving into a space of cold, methodical fury. The lack of an immediate human emotional response is what makes this moment so profoundly unsettling. It's a mirror reflecting a society that had lost its heart, its compassion, its very soul. When he finally arrived back at his home in the hill country of Ephraim, the house that was meant to be a place of reconciliation became the stage for an act of unparalleled horror. What the Levite does next is not an act of grief. It is a gruesome, calculated message. He takes a knife and, in an act that defies comprehension, he dismembers his concubine's body. He divides her into 12 pieces, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. This wasn't a random, crazed act. It was a symbolic political statement of the most shocking kind. He then took these pieces and sent them out with messengers to every corner of Israel. Imagine the scene. A messenger arrives in a village, not with a letter or a decree, but with a horrifying piece of a human body. With it came the Levite's story, his version of the events that transpired in Gibeah. He was sending a message that could not be ignored. It was a visceral, brutal summons. He was essentially saying, look at what has been done. Look at the depravity that exists among us in the tribe of Benjamin. He was forcing the entire nation of Israel to confront the sin that had been allowed to fester in their midst. It was a declaration of atrocity, a demand for a response, a call to war unlike any other. The horror of what happened to one woman was about to engulf an entire nation. The Bible tells us that everyone who saw it said, "Nothing like this has ever been seen or done from the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt to this day." Think about that. In all their history, through slavery, wanderings, and wars, they had never witnessed such a depraved act from within their own people. This was a wake-up call, a terrifying mirror showing them what they had become in the absence of righteous leadership. The period of the Judges was a time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and this was the horrifying result. The leaders and people of the 11 tribes of Israel were rightly outraged. They couldn't just stand by and let this happen. A national assembly was called at a place called Mizpah. It was a massive gathering, a unified front demanding to know what had happened and why. The Levite stood before them and recounted the entire sordid tale, the inhospitable reception, the evil intentions of the men of Gibeah, and the ultimate tragic fate of his concubine. The evidence was undeniable, and the collective conscience of the nation was stirred. They were united in their goal, Justice must be served. This wasn't about revenge. It was about purging a deep, corrupting evil from their midst. So, the United Tribes of Israel sent a clear message to the tribe of Benjamin, in whose territory the city of Gibeah was located. Their demand was simple and just, hand over the wicked men of Gibeah so we can put them to death and purge the evil from Israel. It was a chance for the tribe of Benjamin to do the right thing, to condemn the actions of their own and stand with the rest of the nation for what was right. It was a test of their moral character. Would they choose justice and righteousness, or would they choose to protect their own, even when their own were guilty of a monstrous crime? Tragically, the tribe of Benjamin made a disastrous choice. They refused. Instead of handing over the perpetrators, they chose to defend them. They gathered their own army to fight against their brother tribes. It's a shocking turn of events. Why would they do this? Pride? A twisted sense of tribal loyalty? Whatever the reason, their refusal to deal with the sin in their own camp set the stage for a devastating civil war. This single decision to protect evil rather than confront it would have consequences that would ripple through their entire generation and nearly lead to the complete annihilation of their tribe. What followed was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Israel's history. A brutal civil war erupted, brother against brother. The United Tribes, though much larger in number, suffered staggering losses in the initial battles. It wasn't until they earnestly sought God's guidance and humbled themselves that the tide turned. In the end, the tribe of Benjamin was almost completely wiped out. Cities were burned, and a vow was made not to give their daughters in marriage to the few remaining Benjamite men, threatening to erase the tribe from existence entirely. So how did it all come to this? How did a nation chosen by God fall into such a horrific cycle of violence and self-destruction? It all boils down to a few key failures. First, sin was ignored and allowed to fester. The evil in Gibeah wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the result of a slow moral decay. Second, leadership failed. There was no king, no central authority to uphold God's law and guide the people. Third, and most importantly, God's law was abandoned. When people reject God's standards for life and morality, they create their own, which inevitably leads to chaos. And finally, when all these things happen, human life loses its value. People become disposable, and acts of unspeakable cruelty become possible. These stories show us the horrifying consequences when a society loses its moral compass and sin becomes the new normal. Think about it. When leaders, especially spiritual ones, lack genuine compassion, it's a recipe for disaster. Their influence can lead people down a dark path where injustice is ignored and evil is allowed to grow. Silence in the face of wrongdoing is just as damaging. What these difficult passages ultimately reveal is how deeply God values human life. He shows us the ugliest parts of our fallen nature to remind us of the high cost of sin and to call us back to a life of love, justice, and compassion. It's a tough lesson, but a vital one. Thanks for watching. You're subscribed with notifications on.